The courtroom was filled with tension, the air thick with anticipation. Every eye in the room was fixed on the judge, who stood poised, ready to deliver a decision that would forever change the course of the owner's life. A hush had fallen over the gathering, as if the very walls themselves were holding their breath. The owners sat at the defendant's table, their hands clenched tightly, the weight of their entire future hanging by a thread. Their loyal companion, a calm and well-trained dog, sat quietly at their side, offering a steady presence amidst the chaos. Outside, a storm had begun to stir, but in the courtroom, the storm was already inside, swirling with uncertainty and fear. Then, in an instant, the quiet was shattered. The dog, who had been so still and composed, suddenly sprang to life. With a loud, forceful bark, it broke the silence, the sound echoing off the walls and shaking the room. The judge faltered for a moment, looking up, clearly startled. The spectators looked at each other in confusion, and the courtroom buzzed with murmurs. What was happening? Why would the dog, known for its calm nature, suddenly bark so loudly at this exact moment? Everyone in the room went still, as though time itself had momentarily paused. The judge's gaze locked onto the dog, and there was an unusual shift in his demeanor. It wasn't anger or frustration, but something else, something harder to place. He seemed to be contemplating the dog's behavior as if there was a message in it, something the rest of the courtroom had missed. The handler, who had trained the dog for years, was equally confused. This was not typical behavior. What could this sudden outburst mean? The owner's heart raced as they turned to look at their dog, trying to make sense of the scene unfolding before them. They hadn't expected this interruption at such a crucial moment. But as they met the dog's gaze, there was something almost knowing in its eyes. As if the dog had understood something deeper, something hidden from the human eye. Could it be that the dog was trying to tell them something? Was this bark, at this very moment, a sign of something greater? As the judge stood there, his eyes still on the dog, the room fell completely silent once more. The uncertainty hung in the air, the weight of it palpable. The question lingered in everyone's minds. When the dog barked at the judge, nobody expected the life-changing moment that was about to unfold. The weight of the world seemed to rest on Robert's shoulders as he sat in the small, dimly lit courtroom. His eyes, weary and shadowed with years of pain, scanned the room without truly seeing it. The noise of the crowd, the rustle of papers, and the distant hum of the courthouse all faded into a dull roar. All he could hear was the pounding of his own heart, thudding in his chest like the heavy footsteps of someone walking toward him, a step closer to a life he didn't recognize anymore. The past few months had been a blur of sleepless nights, endless paperwork, and a battle that seemed never-ending. But more than anything, it was the feeling of not knowing whether he would walk out of this room with his life intact or shattered beyond repair. Robert Taylor, once a respected military medic, had seen the worst of humanity. But nothing compared to the helplessness he felt now. His wife, Jennifer, had been the love of his life, and losing her to a tragic accident had taken everything from him. The silver streaks in his dark hair, the deep lines that carved his face like the grooves of an old, weathered map, were not just signs of aging, they were reminders of a life that had been ripped away in an instant. The accident that had claimed Jennifer's life had left Robert with a sense of emptiness, a hollow shell of the man he once was. Every day felt like a struggle to just get through. But through it all, one thing remained constant: his daughter, Sophie. Sophie had been his reason to wake up every day. At only 6 years old, she was already a wise soul, filled with an innocent hope and love that seemed to radiate from her every step. But life had been unkind to her too. A car accident had left her with a traumatic brain injury when she was just 3, and since then, she had battled the unpredictable storm of epilepsy. The seizures came without warning, robbing Sophie of moments of her childhood and leaving Robert to watch in helpless despair. It wasn't just the physical toll, it was the emotional weight of seeing his daughter fight every day and knowing that there was nothing he could do to make it better. Yet, Sophie remained a beacon of light. Her spirit was unbreakable, and her unwavering optimism had always been her greatest strength. But Sophie's strength wasn't the only thing that had helped Robert through the darkest of times. At his side, always, was his faithful companion, Dakota. A German shepherd, once broken and abandoned, now a constant presence in Robert's life. He had found Dakota just after Jennifer's death. The dog had been found badly abused, fractured ribs, burns, and scars from years of mistreatment. It was clear that someone had tried to destroy the dog, but Dakota had refused to die. Robert, too, had refused to die inside, despite the weight of his grief. He had taken Dakota in, nursing the dog back to health with the same tenderness he used to care for his patients. As the dog healed, so did Robert. In ways that he could not fully understand, Dakota became a silent partner in his healing process. From the moment Dakota had come into their lives, the bond between the dog and Sophie had been immediate and profound. The dog had shown a remarkable sensitivity to Sophie's needs, never leaving her side during her seizures. Dakota would always be there to comfort Sophie when the episodes passed, pressing his head against her, offering warmth and reassurance. The dog had become a protector, a silent guardian of Sophie's world. And in return, Sophie had given Dakota a home, a place where he was no longer broken, no longer unwanted. She would sit with him for hours, reading her favorite books aloud to him, talking to him like a trusted friend. For Sophie, Dakota was more than just a dog. He was her confidant, her source of comfort, and her symbol of resilience. And for Robert, Dakota had become more than just a pet. He was a lifeline. Now, as Robert sat in the courtroom, staring at the legal papers in front of him, he could feel the weight of the impending decision. The conflict was clear. His ex-wife's family had filed for custody of Sophie, arguing that Robert was unfit to raise her. The accusations were unfounded, rooted in the tragic circumstances of Sophie's illness and the emotional toll it had taken on him. But the legal system wasn't always kind, especially when it came to matters of custody and family. And now, it seemed like Robert's world was slipping away once again. Dakota, as always, sat by Robert's side, calm and unwavering. The dog's presence was his anchor, the only thing that kept him grounded in this moment of uncertainty. Robert looked down at his faithful companion, the dog's dark eyes meeting his with an understanding that went beyond words. It was as if Dakota knew what was at stake and was silently promising to be there, no matter what the outcome. For Robert, Dakota represented everything that was good and pure in this world: loyalty, love, and the unwavering belief that no matter how difficult life became, there was always a way forward, as long as you had someone by your side. But what no one in that courtroom knew, what no one could have anticipated, was the role Dakota would play in the days to come. The dog's presence, his loyalty, and the deep connection between him and Sophie would prove to be the key to unlocking a life-changing moment, one that no one expected, but that would forever alter the course of their lives. The courtroom was quiet, too quiet, as if the very air held its breath, waiting for the gavel to fall. The oak-paneled walls and rows of wooden seats stood stark and solemn, offering little comfort to those who filled the room. The judge's bench, elevated and imposing, loomed ahead, casting its shadow over the proceedings. The air was thick with tension, every eye locked on the judge, waiting for the verdict that could change everything. The audience, a sea of anxious faces, shifted in their seats, the tension palpable in the room. Robert Taylor sat at the defendant's table, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edges. It was the only thing keeping him grounded as the world around him spun with uncertainty. He could feel the weight of every stare upon him, some sympathetic, others cold and judgmental. His ex-wife's family, who had filed for custody of his daughter Sophie, sat nearby, their expressions stiff with expectation. They wanted Sophie. They believed she would be better off with them, away from the chaos and the pain that had plagued Robert's life ever since the tragic accident that had taken his wife and altered Sophie's future. But Robert knew better. He knew Sophie needed him just as much as he needed her. They were all each other had left, and no one, not even family, could understand the bond they shared, the bond that had been forged in the fires of grief and healing. The stakes were high, and Robert felt the enormity of the decision weighing down on him like a physical force. If the judge ruled in favor of Sophie's relatives, Robert would lose everything: his home, his future, his daughter. And without Sophie, there was no reason to go on. The quiet moments at home, their evenings spent reading together or simply sitting in silence, would be gone. The pain of the possibility gnawed at Robert, but he didn't let it show. His face remained calm, his exterior composed, but inside, his heart raced. His attention, however, wasn't solely on the judge or the arguments being made. Beside him, as always, was Dakota, his faithful German shepherd. The dog sat quietly, eyes alert, sensing the weight of the moment even if he couldn't comprehend the legal proceedings. Dakota had been Robert's constant companion through the darkest days of his life. It was Dakota who had helped him get out of bed when the grief felt too heavy to bear, Dakota who had licked away his tears on the nights when the weight of everything was just too much to carry. And now, Dakota was with him in this moment, offering silent support as they waited for a decision that could tear their world apart. Dakota had been more than just a pet. He was Robert's lifeline. When the tragic accident had taken Jennifer's life, and Sophie's world had turned upside down, it was Dakota who had been there to bridge the gap. The dog had a quiet, unshakable strength about him. Even though he, too, had faced cruelty in his past, he had never hesitated to give Robert and Sophie everything he had: loyalty, comfort, and an understanding that went beyond words. Dakota had been the one to sit beside Sophie during her seizures, his calm presence helping to ease the fear and uncertainty. When Sophie had trouble sleeping at night, Dakota would curl up at her feet, offering warmth and comfort, and the child would drift off to sleep, the dog's steady presence a source of peace. Robert had always been a man of science, a veteran who had seen his share of trauma and loss. But it was Dakota who had taught him the power of love and loyalty in ways he could never have imagined. He had witnessed firsthand how the dog could sense when Sophie's health was at risk, how Dakota would alert him before a seizure even happened, the dog's heightened sensitivity to the child's condition becoming a lifeline in a world full of unpredictability. He had seen how the dog could sense his own distress, his grief, and how Dakota would respond with calm, gentle nudges or an affectionate paw placed softly on Robert's lap. In a life filled with uncertainty, Dakota had been the one constant, the one thing that had never wavered. As Robert sat in the courtroom, he knew that the outcome of this case wasn't just about custody, it was about the future of their family, the future of their bond. He had no idea how the judge would rule, but one thing was certain: Dakota was the only thing that kept him from completely losing himself. Without Dakota, he didn't know how he could survive the overwhelming weight of his grief. Without Sophie, without Dakota, there would be no reason to keep going. The thought of losing them both was unbearable. The lawyer representing Sophie's relatives stood now, making his final arguments, but Robert wasn't fully listening. His thoughts kept drifting back to the bond he shared with Sophie and the way Dakota had always been there, how the dog had seen them through the darkest of times. He remembered the first day Dakota had come into their lives, battered and broken, just like Robert himself. It had been Sophie who had named him, and from that day on, they had become a family, each of them healing the other in ways they didn't fully understand at the time. Robert's focus was broken when he felt a subtle movement at his side. Dakota, sensing Robert's rising anxiety, had shifted closer to him, his warm body pressing against Robert's leg in a silent gesture of support. Robert glanced down at the dog, and their eyes met. There was a deep, unwavering trust between them, a bond that needed no words. Dakota had always known when Robert needed him most, and now, as the courtroom waited for the judge's ruling, Robert found solace in that simple, quiet connection. A hush fell over the room as the judge rose from his seat, the weight of the moment falling heavily on everyone present. The judge's eyes swept across the room, scanning the faces of the people who had come here today, each with their own agenda, each with their own hopes and fears. But it wasn't just the legal arguments that would sway his decision. It was the story of Robert and Sophie, the story of a father and daughter who had been through more than most could ever imagine, and the story of a dog who had been the glue holding them all together. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The judge's gavel hovered in the air, ready to strike down a decision that would change everything. But in that moment, with Dakota at his side, Robert knew one thing for certain. No matter what the judge decided, the bond they shared would never be broken. Robert Taylor had never expected to find himself here. The sterile walls of the courtroom, the crisp white shirts and black robes of the lawyers, the cold glares of Sophie's relatives, all of it felt foreign to him, like something out of a nightmare that he couldn't quite escape. He had been a soldier once, a man of action, trained to face danger and make difficult decisions. But nothing had prepared him for the agony of losing his wife, Jennifer, and then watching his daughter, Sophie, struggle with an illness that took away her childhood. Now, he was here, fighting not just for custody of Sophie but for the very essence of what had kept him alive. His relationship with her and the unspoken bond they shared with Dakota, the dog who had saved them both. The weight of his past hung over him like a storm cloud that never fully dissipated. Robert had once been a confident man, a proud veteran who had served his country with honor. He had saved lives on the battlefield, comforted the wounded, and faced death without flinching. But the death of his wife had torn down the man he once was. The grief was so overwhelming that, at times, it felt like an insurmountable wave crashing over him, pulling him under. He had tried to move forward, to put one foot in front of the other for Sophie's sake, but the truth was, every step felt like a struggle. When the accident had happened, Robert had been helpless. He couldn't save Jennifer. He couldn't protect her from the car that had slammed into their vehicle on that fateful night. She was gone in an instant, leaving Robert to pick up the pieces of his shattered life. He had watched Sophie, too, lose something that night, the carefree joy of a child who was too young to fully understand the depths of loss. Sophie had been just 3 years old when the accident happened, and though she didn't have the words to express her pain, Robert could see it in her eyes. She had inherited Jennifer's strength and grace, but in the wake of the accident, she had been forced to grow up too quickly. And then there were the seizures. Robert had never known a peaceable night since they began. Sophie would be playing or laughing, lost in her world, and then it would happen. Her body would stiffen, her eyes would roll back, and Robert would watch in helpless terror as she fell to the ground, unable to stop it. The doctors told him that there was little they could do. Epilepsy was an unpredictable beast, a condition that would shadow Sophie for the rest of her life. Every seizure felt like a piece of Robert's heart was being torn away, like watching a piece of his daughter's spirit being stolen by something invisible, something he couldn't fight. There had been countless hospital visits, the long hours waiting in cold, fluorescent-lit rooms, hoping for a breakthrough that never came. Robert had stopped counting the nights spent by Sophie's side, watching over her as she slept, hoping the next morning would bring a little more peace. But as the days passed, the emotional toll began to wear on him. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating, and felt like a shadow of the man he used to be. His hands trembled as he helped Sophie take her medication, and his heart ached every time she looked at him with those big, searching eyes, as if asking him why her life had been so unfair. In the darkest moments, when he couldn't find the strength to go on, it was Dakota who had been there. The German Shepherd had been a broken dog when Robert first found him. Dakota had been abandoned, left to fend for himself on the streets, a puppy with shattered ribs, burns, and a deep mistrust of humans. Robert had recognized something in the dog's eyes, a raw, untapped pain that mirrored his own. They were both survivors, both wounded in ways that others couldn't understand. So, Robert had brought him home, and in doing so, he had unwittingly saved not just the dog but himself. Dakota had been a quiet presence at first, following Robert around the house, sitting at his feet, watching him with the intense eyes of a dog who had seen too much. But over time, the bond between them had grown, stronger than anything Robert had ever experienced. The dog became his anchor, a steady source of calm amidst the chaos. It wasn't just that Dakota was loyal, he was something more. The dog could sense when Robert was struggling, when the weight of his grief became too much to bear. There were nights when Robert's anxiety would flare up, when the memories of Jennifer and the accident would overwhelm him, and Dakota would be there, placing his head on Robert's knee or sitting by his side, offering silent support. It was in those moments that Robert realized how deeply the dog understood him. Dakota never judged him, never expected him to be anything other than what he was, broken, but trying. When Robert had a panic attack, Dakota would nudge him gently, guiding him back to calm with his steady presence. When Robert would bury his face in his hands, overwhelmed with grief, Dakota would curl up next to him, offering his warmth as if to remind Robert that, even in the darkest times, he wasn't alone. The dog's role went beyond just comfort. Dakota had an uncanny ability to sense when Sophie's seizures were about to happen. He would become restless, pacing or whining before Sophie would drop to the floor, her body seizing uncontrollably. In those moments, Dakota would press himself against Sophie, his weight offering stability and comfort. It was as though he had a sixth sense, a connection to Sophie that went beyond anything Robert could explain. There had been times when Robert hadn't noticed the signs of an impending seizure, but Dakota had. It was as if the dog had known what was coming before anyone else did. Sophie had always been a bright, cheerful girl despite her illness, but there were days when the fear of the seizures would steal her joy. On those days, Dakota became her protector, her constant source of comfort. Robert had seen the way Sophie's face would light up when she saw Dakota after a seizure, as if the dog's presence was the one thing that could make everything feel normal again. The bond between them was a language all its own, silent, yet profound. As the legal battle continued, Robert often found himself turning to Dakota for strength. The dog had become more than just a pet. He was a lifeline, a constant reminder of the love that still existed in Robert's heart. Even as his world seemed to fall apart, Dakota was there, steadfast and true. And it was in those quiet moments of connection that Robert found the strength to fight. For Sophie, for Dakota, and for himself. In the courtroom, as Robert sat at the edge of his seat, waiting for the judge to make a decision that could change everything, he knew that no matter what happened, he had already won. With Dakota by his side, he had rediscovered something he thought he had lost forever, the power of unconditional love, and the strength that came from knowing he wasn't alone in his struggle. The air in the courtroom felt thick, as though it had grown heavier with every passing moment. The walls seemed to close in on Robert, the noise around him blurring into a distant hum. The once calm demeanor he had relied on was cracking, a crack that seemed to widen with every word spoken by Sophie's relative's lawyer. Their accusations were sharp and unrelenting, aimed directly at his ability to care for Sophie. They spoke of his emotional instability, his struggle to balance work and the constant care Sophie needed, his inability to provide the stability they believed was necessary for a child to thrive. It wasn't that Robert didn't know the truth, they had their facts right, but hearing those facts thrown in his face like accusations made his heart ache with the raw pain of helplessness. Robert shifted in his seat, trying to mask the anxiety rising within him. His palms were clammy, his heart racing. He had never felt more vulnerable in his life, not even in the darkest moments of his military service, when bullets flew and his own life hung by a thread. At least then he could take action. Here, there was nothing he could do but sit, listen, and try to defend a life that seemed to be slipping from his grasp. The lawyer continued, highlighting the moments when Sophie had struggled, when Robert had failed to provide the perfect environment for her. Sophie's epilepsy was unpredictable. The seizures came without warning, and despite his best efforts, there were times when Robert couldn't stop them. The room seemed to hold its breath as the lawyer painted a picture of a father who was, in their eyes, struggling to manage the responsibility of a sick child. It was a nightmare that Robert knew all too well. The words stung, each one landing like a punch to the gut. But then, from beneath the table, Robert felt a familiar weight. Dakota. The dog had been sitting quietly at his side since the moment they walked in, but now he shifted closer, gently pressing his body against Robert's leg. The simple gesture, the gentle pressure, was enough to ground him. Dakota's presence was a silent reminder that he wasn't alone, even if the world outside felt like it was falling apart. Robert reached down and scratched the dog's ears absent-mindedly, the familiar action grounding him. Dakota responded with a soft, appreciative grunt, his tail lightly tapping against the floor. The dog's calm presence was like a lifeline, a tether to reality when everything else seemed overwhelming. It was moments like these that made Robert realize how much he depended on Dakota, not just for companionship, but for emotional stability. The dog wasn't just there physically, he was there in a way that no human could be. Dakota understood the unspoken turmoil in Robert's heart, the fear, the doubt, the panic, and in the simplest way, he offered comfort. As the opposing lawyer's voice grew louder, Robert's grip on the table tightened, his knuckles turning white. His mind raced, trying to focus on the words being spoken, but the noise around him drowned out his thoughts. The weight of the decision ahead felt insurmountable. What if he lost? What if they took Sophie from him? He had already lost so much, he couldn't bear to lose her too. The thought of being separated from his daughter, of watching someone else raise her, felt like a betrayal of the love they had fought so hard to maintain. Just as the anxiety threatened to overwhelm him, Dakota did something unexpected. He nudged Robert's arm with his head, as though telling him to snap out of it. Robert looked down, meeting the dog's steady gaze. For a moment, everything else faded away. The dog's eyes were calm and knowing, full of empathy and unwavering loyalty. There was something in Dakota's expression that made Robert feel like everything might be okay. It wasn't that the dog could solve all his problems, but in that simple look, Robert found the strength to breathe. He wasn't alone. He had Dakota, and he had Sophie, and that was enough to keep him fighting. The moments when Dakota provided this kind of comfort were becoming more frequent as the trial progressed. The dog's sensitivity to Robert's emotions was something that couldn't be explained away by logic or reason. It was a connection that went deeper than anything the courtroom could understand. Every time Robert's anxiety surged, Dakota would subtly respond, shifting closer or resting his head on Robert's knee as if to say, "I'm here." These small gestures, repeated over and over again, became the anchor Robert clung to. They weren't just distractions from the legal battle. They were reminders that, despite the uncertainty, he had something to fight for. And then, as the trial continued, there were moments when the tension in the courtroom seemed to reach a breaking point. The opposing lawyer's words became sharper, more accusatory, as they questioned Robert's fitness as a father. The accusations of neglect, of emotional instability, began to feel like a barrage of bullets, each one hitting its mark. Robert's chest tightened with every word, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His hands were shaking, his mind racing, and for a moment, it felt as though everything he had built, his relationship with Sophie, his bond with Dakota, was on the verge of crumbling. Dakota, however, seemed to sense the shift. His body tensed, and for the first time during the trial, he stood up, his muscles rippling beneath his fur. His eyes, once calm, were now alert, focused on Robert. The dog moved slightly, shifting his position in a way that seemed deliberate, as though he could feel the weight of Robert's mounting distress. The change in Dakota's behavior didn't go unnoticed. Robert could feel the dog's presence, steady and constant, like a protective shield around him. Dakota's alertness was a subtle signal, a reminder that the dog was tuned into his every emotion, his every fear. The lawyer's voice continued, but now it sounded muffled, as though the room was closing in. Robert's focus was on Dakota, who had positioned himself in front of him, as though standing guard. The dog's posture was firm, protective, his tail held high, and his eyes locked onto Robert with an intensity that seemed to say, "I've got this. You're not alone." It was a moment that transcended words, a moment when the bond between the dog and owner became undeniably clear. For the first time during the trial, Robert found himself feeling a sense of calm, an unspoken strength flowing through him. The dog was his anchor. The dog was his shield. And in this moment, the dog was the only one who truly understood the depth of Robert's internal struggle. As the day wore on, The courtroom scenes began to blur together. Testimonies, arguments, objections. But through it all, Dakota remained a steady presence. The dog's calm demeanor, his subtle shifts of positioning, and his unwavering loyalty became a beacon of support in the midst of Robert's emotional turmoil. Each moment, each subtle signal from Dakota seemed to fortify Robert's resolve. With the dog by his side, he could face whatever came next. They had weathered storms together, and no matter what the courtroom decided, Robert knew that he and Dakota could face anything. The dog's behavior had become a quiet but powerful reassurance, one that couldn't be explained away by logic, but that had a significance all its own. Dakota wasn't just a dog. He was Robert's anchor, his protector, and his constant reminder that, even in the darkest of times, there was hope, there was strength, and there was love. The air in the courtroom was suffocating, thick with the weight of the decision that was about to be made. The opposing lawyer had just finished his final remarks, and the tension in the room was at an all-time high. Every eye in the room was on the judge as he prepared to announce his decision. The sound of the gavel seemed to echo louder in Robert's mind than it did in the actual room. He sat there, a storm of emotions brewing within him. His hands were trembling, his palms slick with sweat. His heart raced in his chest, threatening to break free from its confines. Sophie's face flashed in his mind, her bright eyes, her laughter, her fierce love for Dakota, and he felt a pang of panic. What if this was it? What if everything he fought for, his daughter, his family, slipped through his fingers? Beside him, Dakota sat calmly, his body still, his eyes steady as he surveyed the room. The dog was Robert's anchor, his constant, unshakable presence. If anyone in the room understood the weight of this moment, it was Dakota. The bond between them had been forged in the fires of grief and healing, and as Robert's anxiety continued to rise, Dakota's steady calm was a small comfort, a reminder that no matter what happened in this sterile, intimidating place, he would never be alone. As the judge adjusted his glasses, preparing to speak, the silence in the courtroom became almost unbearable. The judge raised his gavel, and at that very moment, a loud, forceful bark broke the stillness. The sound shattered the tension in the room like glass breaking underfoot. It was sharp, unexpected, and far louder than anyone could have anticipated. The force of the bark seemed to ripple through the room, causing a collective gasp. Heads turned, and everyone froze, eyes wide, mouths slightly agape. Robert's heart skipped a beat as his eyes snapped to Dakota, his chest tight with confusion. Dakota had never done this before. The dog, normally calm and composed, had just bellowed out in the most dramatic, unsettling way possible. The room, already on edge, seemed to breathe in sharply, as though caught in the same moment of shock. The courtroom's previously hushed air was now filled with the echoes of Dakota's bark, a sound that seemed to carry with it an energy all its own. Robert's eyes widened in disbelief. Why had Dakota barked at that exact moment? What could possibly have triggered it? The judge, clearly startled by the sudden interruption, froze for a second before lowering his gavel. His face, usually stern and unflappable, showed signs of confusion. His brow furrowed as he glanced down at the dog, and for a moment, Robert could have sworn he saw something like a flicker of recognition in the judge's eyes, like he was trying to understand why the dog had chosen this precise moment to disrupt the proceedings. He opened his mouth, but the words didn't come out right away. The audience, too, seemed in a state of suspended animation. Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The tension that had been so thick just moments ago was now joined by an undeniable unease. The dog's bark had thrown them off balance. Some looked at each other in confusion, others in disbelief, while a few tried to suppress nervous laughter, unsure of how to react to this unexpected break in the formality of the court. No one had expected a dog, much less a German shepherd, to bark so forcefully in the midst of such a critical moment. The noise felt almost out of place. This wasn't supposed to happen in a courtroom. The opposing lawyer, recovering from his initial shock, quickly adjusted his suit and cleared his throat. "Your Honor, "I apologize for the disturbance," he said in a strained voice. "Please, allow me to remove the animal. This is highly irregular." Robert looked down at Dakota, still sitting beside him, his body tense, his eyes unwavering. The dog was not reacting the way one might expect from an animal in such a public space. Instead of backing down or retreating, Dakota remained firmly planted beside Robert, his gaze locked on the judge, unblinking and unflinching. The dog's posture was now alert, his body almost rigid with attention. There was no hesitation in Dakota's stance, no uncertainty. He was not merely reacting to the noise, the courtroom, or the chaos. He was watching, waiting, as though he knew something was at stake, something far more important than any legal argument or decision. "Dakota," Robert whispered, his voice trembling, though his hand reached down instinctively to calm the dog. But the dog didn't move. His focus remained completely fixed, his ears forward, his eyes trained on the judge. "Please, Your Honor," the lawyer continued, speaking again, though his voice was now tinged with an edge of urgency. "This is disrupting the proceedings. I ask that you have the animal removed." The judge, still visibly taken aback, cleared his throat, his expression a mix of confusion and uncertainty. His hand hovered near his gavel, but there was something else in his gaze, something like a quiet contemplation. He didn't immediately respond. Instead, his eyes lingered on Dakota, watching the dog's behavior with a level of intensity that was rare for someone so accustomed to courtroom procedure. Robert couldn't explain it. He couldn't understand why the dog had barked, why Dakota was acting this way. He had trained the dog to be calm, to be composed in any situation. And yet, here he was, in the middle of one of the most critical moments of Robert's life, interrupting the proceedings with a bark that no one had expected. The confusion swirled inside Robert's chest like a storm. What did this mean? Why had Dakota reacted so strongly, so suddenly? It was the judge's voice, quiet but firm, that eventually broke through the tension. "Mr. Taylor," the judge said, his tone measured, though still a bit shaken. "I would like to understand what this disturbance means. Please, tell me what's happening." Robert's throat tightened as he realized that the judge was waiting for an explanation, and he found that he didn't know what to say. What could he say? I don't know, Your Honor," Robert said quietly. "I've never seen him react like this." The judge raised an eyebrow, then glanced toward the dog once more. "It's clear the dog is not acting in the manner expected for an animal in such a setting," he said, his voice surprisingly soft. "But why now? Why this moment?" Robert's heart pounded as he stared at the judge, his mind racing. Could it be that Dakota was trying to tell them something? Something that Robert couldn't quite put into words? The dog's alertness, his fixed gaze on the judge, it was as though he had sensed something. What if, in that moment, Dakota knew something the rest of them didn't? The courtroom was silent again, everyone watching, waiting. The seconds stretched on like an eternity. Robert's hand remained gently resting on Dakota's back, the dog's fur warm beneath his fingers, his presence a comforting weight against Robert's anxiety. As the silence deepened, Robert could only hope that the dog's bark had meant something more than a mere disruption, that somehow, some way, it would be the catalyst for something good to come from this trial. But as the judge leaned back in his seat, he made no move to ask for Dakota to be removed. Instead, his eyes softened slightly. "We'll take a brief recess," the judge finally declared, his voice carrying an air of finality. "Mr. Taylor, I think it's time we all took a moment to reflect." The gavel fell with a resounding thud, but it wasn't as loud as the silence that followed, leaving everyone in the courtroom suspended in a moment they hadn't expected, their hearts still racing from the bark that had changed everything. The silence in the courtroom felt like it stretched for an eternity, longer than any pause Robert had ever known. The judge, still standing, held the gavel in his hand, but he didn't bring it down. His eyes remained fixed on Dakota, whose posture hadn't wavered. There was no reprimand, no swift motion to have the dog removed. Instead, the judge's gaze lingered, and Robert saw something shift in the judge's expression. A flicker of something more than confusion, perhaps understanding. It was subtle, but it was there, as if the judge was seeing more than just a dog causing an unexpected ruckus. The moment felt loaded, like the air itself had charged with something unspoken. The judge's stern expression softened, and his brow furrowed not in irritation, but in thought. He studied Dakota closely for a moment longer, his eyes narrowing as though trying to decipher something only the dog could understand. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the judge to respond. The courtroom was on edge, no one knew what was happening. But Robert noticed the shift in the judge's demeanor. It was almost as if the dog's interruption was more than an accident, more than a moment of distraction. The judge shifted his gaze back to Robert, then to Dakota, then back again. It was as if he was piecing something together in his mind, something that, in the midst of all the arguments, had been left unnoticed. The dog's presence, the unflinching way he sat there, poised and still, was somehow different. More than just a companion, more than just a pet. There was something in Dakota's eyes, something that resonated with the judge, though Robert couldn't fully understand what it was. The pause was almost imperceptible, but it was there, the weight of it thick in the air. Finally, the judge spoke, his voice breaking the silence with a calm yet authoritative tone. "Mr. Taylor," he began, his eyes still studying the dog, "I must admit, I've never seen anything quite like this in all my years in the courtroom. But I will not reprimand the dog. This interruption, there's more to it, isn't there?" Robert felt a surge of confusion and relief. He hadn't expected the judge to acknowledge the dog's actions in such a way. The room shifted slightly, as though everyone was trying to process what had just happened. No one moved, no one spoke, but Robert could feel the collective tension in the room. It wasn't just the dog causing a distraction, there was something more to it, something Robert hadn't been able to put into words until now. The judge paused again, his eyes scanning Robert's face, trying to understand the significance of Dakota's behavior. It was as though he had come to an unspoken realization, a moment of clarity that seemed to connect the dots. Robert watched in silence, his mind racing. The judge wasn't angry or annoyed, he wasn't immediately looking for a solution to the disturbance. Instead, it was almost as if he was considering the possibility that the dog's actions were telling him something deeper than just a random outburst. As the judge looked away for a moment, Robert's mind began to whirl. He hadn't fully understood it before. How could he? He had been so focused on the pressure of the legal battle, so consumed with the fear of losing Sophie, that he hadn't noticed the full extent of the bond between him, Sophie, and Dakota. But now, in the quiet of the courtroom, it was becoming clear to him, as if the moment itself had unlocked a deeper understanding. Dakota wasn't just barking at the judge out of nowhere. The dog was alerting. The dog had sensed something, a shift in the atmosphere, a shift in Robert's emotions. He had sensed that Robert was on the edge, that the weight of the legal battle, the fear of losing Sophie, was becoming too much to bear. Dakota was there to help, to support, just as he had always been. The dog wasn't merely providing emotional support, he was responding to something critical, something invisible to everyone else. Robert's throat tightened as the realization hit him. The dog had been more than just a companion to him and Sophie. Dakota had been a constant, steady presence, a symbol of loyalty and unwavering support in the face of their struggles. But there was more. Dakota had always known when things were about to get difficult, when Robert was about to break, when Sophie needed extra care, when the emotional burden was too much. The dog had become their early warning system, their protector in ways that went beyond the physical. He had seen things that Robert couldn't see, felt things that Robert couldn't feel. Dakota was more than just a pet. He was their lifeline. In the quiet that followed the judge's words, Robert spoke up, his voice shaking but steady. "Your Honor," he began, his eyes fixed on the judge, but his words directed to the entire room. "I know this may seem unusual, but this dog, Dakota, he's not just a dog. He's been with us through everything. Robert paused, swallowing the lump in his throat. He looked down at Dakota, who was still sitting at his side, alert and unwavering. He's been a source of comfort when nothing else could reach me. When Sophie started having seizures, when she was in pain, Dakota was the one who stayed with her. He knew when a seizure was coming before we did. He'd bark, alert me, and I'd have just enough time to help her. He's been the one constant in our lives since everything fell apart. Robert's voice cracked slightly, but he continued, his heart swelling with emotion. When I couldn't sleep at night, when the grief from losing Jennifer kept me awake, Dakota would lie next to me, just there, silent but present. He would stay with me, reminding me that I wasn't alone. He's more than just a dog to us. He's a part of our family. And I believe he's trying to tell us something here, something important. The judge looked at Robert for a long moment, his expression unreadable. But Robert could see the shift in his eyes, the softening, the understanding. It was as though the judge was beginning to see beyond the arguments and legalities, beyond the harsh words spoken by the opposing lawyer. He was beginning to understand that this wasn't just about legalities. This was about a family, about a bond between a father, a daughter, and a dog that couldn't be broken. The judge leaned forward slightly, his gaze softening. "Mr. Taylor," he said quietly, "I hear you. I understand the bond you share with this dog. And I believe you're right. This moment, this interruption, it's more than just a disruption. It's a sign. Perhaps, as you say, it's something important." The weight of the judge's words hit Robert like a wave crashing over him. There was no anger, no dismissal in the judge's tone. Instead, there was a quiet recognition of the bond between them, acknowledgement of the love and loyalty that had been built over years of shared struggle and healing. It was a moment that, for the first time in the entire trial, felt like Robert wasn't just fighting for Sophie's future. He was fighting for what they had all fought for together, their family. The dog's bark had not just been a random outburst. It had been a message, a signal that their bond, their connection, was too deep to ignore. Robert's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and gratitude. He had known it all along, but now the courtroom, the judge, the lawyers, the audience, seemed to understand it too. This wasn't just a custody battle. It was about a life, a family, and a dog who had become the thread that tied it all together. As Robert looked down at Dakota, he realized, for the first time in a long while, that everything was going to be okay. The love they shared was real. It was undeniable. And no legal decision, no argument, could ever take that away from them. The judge finally nodded, his expression softened. "I think we've all seen enough. Mr. Taylor, I'm not going to make a decision right away. But I believe we need to consider the full extent of this bond, the bond you share with your daughter and your dog." The room was still, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the next word. But in that moment, Robert realized that the decision was no longer about winning or losing. It was about understanding, about recognizing the power of love, and about acknowledging that some connections, some bonds, were too strong to be broken by mere paperwork or legal arguments. Dakota's bark had changed everything. The gavel had not yet fallen, but in Robert's mind, the courtroom seemed to fade away, replaced by memories that flooded him with a mixture of pain and warmth. As the tension of the trial pressed in on him, it was as though the room itself disappeared and he was back in the moments when life had been less complicated, when he was just a man and his dog, trying to heal in a world that had felt too broken. One moment in particular surfaced, crystal clear in his mind. It was the day he brought Dakota home. The dog had been a mess, frightened, bruised, abandoned by those who should have cared for him. Robert had found him on the outskirts of town, in a small alleyway behind a hardware store, lying in the mud, unable to even lift his head. The dog's ribs were visible under his dirt-smeared fur, and his eyes, those brown eyes, were wide with fear. But there was something in those eyes, something that spoke of survival. Robert knew that look all too well. It was the same look he saw in the mirror every morning. At that moment, Robert had made a decision, though he didn't know it would change his life forever. He had bent down and called to the dog softly, his voice low and reassuring, trying to calm the animal. "It's okay," he had said. "You're safe now." And to his surprise, the dog had looked at him, and something deep and unspoken, had passed between them. The dog didn't bark or growl. Instead, it had just lowered its head, as though understanding that Robert was there to help. Robert had gently picked up the dog, wrapping him in his coat to protect him from the cold. And though the dog had trembled against his chest, he never struggled, never tried to escape. In that moment, the bond between them had begun to form, fragile but undeniable. As Robert had driven home that day, Dakota had sat quietly in the passenger seat, his head resting on Robert's shoulder. Robert had been filled with an overwhelming sense of responsibility. He couldn't save Jennifer, and he couldn't protect Sophie from the pain of her illness. But here was a creature who needed him in a way that seemed so pure, so simple. In the midst of his grief, Dakota became a bridge, a way for Robert to focus on something other than his own pain. But little did Robert know, it was the beginning of something far deeper. A few months later, the bond between Robert and Dakota had deepened in ways he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just the dog's loyalty that began to show, it was his instinct. One night, Robert had found himself spiraling into a panic attack. The weight of Sophie's illness, the overwhelming responsibility of taking care of her alone, the constant fear that something might happen to her, it had all become too much. His breathing had quickened, his heart racing, his chest tight, as if there were no escape. He had stumbled to the kitchen, trying to drink some water, but the dizziness had taken hold of him. His vision blurred, and he felt like he was suffocating. He had collapsed to his knees on the cold tile floor, gasping for air. Panic had seized him, and he had felt utterly alone, like a man drowning in his own mind. And then Dakota had appeared. The dog had quietly padded into the kitchen, his large frame filling the doorway. His eyes, calm and steady, had looked down at Robert with a deep understanding, as though he knew exactly what was happening. Without a sound, Dakota had nudged Robert's arm with his nose, his body pressing against him in a comforting weight. The dog had stayed with him for hours that night, lying beside him on the kitchen floor, offering warmth and support. Whenever Robert's breathing had quickened again, Dakota had responded, nudging him back to calm with his steady presence. For the first time since Jennifer's death, Robert had felt a flicker of peace, not from anything he had done, but from the simple presence of Dakota. The dog had not tried to fix anything. He had not tried to offer solutions. He had simply been there. And for Robert, that had been enough. Weeks later, when Sophie had a particularly severe seizure, one that left her unconscious for hours, Robert had again found himself in a situation where there was nothing he could do. The paramedics had arrived, but their rushed efforts only made him feel more helpless. It had been Dakota who had sensed the danger, who had alerted him to Sophie's condition before anyone else. The dog had paced nervously at the foot of Sophie's bed, barking frantically, his body trembling as he waited for Robert to respond. When Robert had rushed to Sophie's side, Dakota had remained close by, standing guard, watching over her. It was in that moment that Robert realized just how crucial Dakota was. The dog wasn't just offering emotional support, he was providing something far more vital. He was keeping Sophie safe, alerting Robert to the danger before it was too late. Robert had realized that Dakota wasn't just a pet or a companion, he was a protector, a guardian of their fragile little family. He wasn't just a dog with a strong bond to Sophie and Robert. He had become their early warning system, their shield against the uncertainty that had taken over their lives. Without Dakota, Robert knew, the severity of Sophie's illness could have easily gone unnoticed. Without Dakota, he didn't know how he would have gotten through some of the most terrifying moments of his life. As the months passed, Dakota's role had expanded. The dog had become more than just a protector. He had become a lifeline. In moments when Robert could feel himself breaking, Dakota had been there, never demanding, never judging, just offering quiet support. It wasn't just the dog's ability to sense Robert's emotional state. It was the unspoken way he had learned to help, to be there when needed most. The dog had become an integral part of their family's healing process, offering comfort and security when Robert felt like everything else was falling apart. The memories flooded back as Robert sat in the courtroom, the weight of the trial pressing down on him. As he glanced down at Dakota, still sitting by his side, a wave of gratitude washed over him. Dakota had been there through everything, through the darkest of nights, the most fearful of days. He had witnessed Robert's lowest points and had always been there, steadfast and loyal. He had never asked for anything in return but had given everything he had to Robert and Sophie. And now, in this critical moment, as the courtroom held its collective breath, Robert realized that Dakota had done more than just be a dog. He had been the steady thread that held everything together. The bond between them had grown deeper than Robert had ever anticipated, and in that moment, Robert understood something profound. He wasn't just fighting for Sophie's future. He was fighting for the future of the family that had come to be defined by this dog. The dog who had been there every step of the way, never wavering, never leaving their side. It was in the presence of this dog that Robert had learned the true meaning of loyalty, of love, and of healing. Dakota wasn't just a companion. He was a silent, steady force that had helped Robert survive the unimaginable. The emotional breakthrough that Robert had been waiting for had arrived in the form of his dog. His protector, his friend, his family. The realization settled deep in Robert's chest. As the courtroom debated how to proceed, Robert knew that Dakota's behavior wasn't just an interruption. It was a message. It was the dog's way of saying, "I'm here, and I won't leave you, no matter what happens." And in that moment, Robert knew that no matter what the outcome of the trial would be, the bond he shared with Dakota and with Sophie was unbreakable. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, like the heavy weight of an impending storm. Robert had barely taken a breath since the unexpected outburst, his heart still pounding from the shock of Dakota's sudden bark. The air was thick with uncertainty, and every set of eyes in the room seemed to be waiting for something. The judge, still holding the gavel in his hand, glanced over at Robert, his eyes narrowing in thought. The moment had passed, but the echo of that bark, of the dog's inexplicable reaction, hung heavily in the air, as though it had shifted the very energy of the room. Robert's thoughts raced. He couldn't shake the feeling that Dakota's bark had meant something. The dog's alertness, the intensity in his eyes, the way he had responded to the tension in the room, it wasn't just a random outburst. The dog had known something. He had felt the weight of Robert's anxiety, sensed the emotional pressure that had been building for days, weeks, months. But more than that, Dakota had done what he always did. He had stepped forward to protect Robert, to guide him, to offer him that comforting presence that had been his lifeline through so many trials. Robert cleared his throat, his voice steady but laden with emotion as he looked at the judge. "Your Honor, I know this may seem unusual, but I have to explain. Dakota's behavior wasn't just a random reaction. He's not a dog who reacts like that without reason. He's been with us through everything. He's more than just a pet, he's a lifeline." The courtroom was eerily silent as Robert's words hung in the air. He took a deep breath, trying to collect his thoughts, his hands resting on the table as he looked down at Dakota, who sat at his side, calm and unwavering. When Sophie was younger and her seizure started, we didn't know how to handle it. The doctors didn't know either. But Dakota knew. He could sense when a seizure was coming. Long before we could even notice the signs, he would bark, alerting me, helping me to get to Sophie in time. He wasn't just reacting to her. He was protecting her in a way that no one else could. Robert paused for a moment, swallowing hard as he fought to keep his composure. Dakota has saved us time and time again. He has been my rock, my support. But more than that, he's been Sophie's protector. He's not just a dog. He's part of our family, and without him, we wouldn't have made it through. There's no way to explain it. It's something you can't fully understand unless you've experienced it. But Dakota has a special sensitivity to us, to our needs, to our struggles. He's there when I need him, and he's there when Sophie needs him. His bond with us goes beyond anything I could ever put into words." The room was silent again, but this time, the silence wasn't filled with judgment. It was a quiet understanding, as though the weight of Robert's words had begun to settle over everyone in the courtroom. The judge, still sitting at his bench, looked down at Dakota, his brow furrowing in thought. It was as if the pieces were starting to fall into place, the significance of the dog's behavior becoming clearer with each passing second. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, the judge slowly set down the gavel, his gaze never leaving Robert or Dakota. His voice was calm, measured, but there was something softer in his tone, something that hadn't been there before. "Mr. Taylor," he began, his voice echoing through the still room, "I have to admit that I've never encountered a case quite like this. I've seen many things in my time on the bench, but I've never seen a bond between a man and a dog quite like the one you've described." Robert's heart pounded as he listened, his chest tight with the anticipation of what the judge might say next. The weight of the courtroom seemed to press down on him, but the judge's words brought a sense of relief that Robert hadn't anticipated. "I have to consider all the factors in this case, of course," the judge continued, his eyes now shifting to Dakota. "The arguments, the legalities, the impact on the child. But after hearing what you've said, after seeing the connection between you and this dog, I find myself reconsidering." The judge paused, his gaze thoughtful. "It's clear to me that Dakota is not just a companion. He's a part of your family, an integral part of your lives. And I have to acknowledge the role he plays in your emotional and physical well-being." Robert's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't sure if he had heard the judge correctly. The realization that the judge was beginning to understand, beginning to see Dakota's value beyond the surface, was overwhelming. The judge shifted in his seat, his hand resting on the arm of his chair. "I have to admit, I've been focused so much on the legal aspects of this case that I overlooked the deeper emotional bond. But in light of what you've shared, I have to recognize that this dog is more than just an animal. He's a lifeline. And that lifeline is vital, not just to you, Mr. Taylor, but to your daughter as well." Robert's eyes filled with tears as the judge's words sank in. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. In a world of legal jargon and cold facts, the judge had recognized the truth that Robert had known all along. Dakota wasn't just a dog. He was a part of their family, and the judge had seen it. The courtroom seemed to shift around Robert as the judge made his decision. There was no dramatic gavel fall, no final verdict, no harsh words of judgment. Instead, the judge's voice carried a quiet authority as he spoke once more. "Given the exceptional circumstances of this case," the judge said, "and in recognition of the critical role this dog has played in Mr. Taylor's and his daughter's well-being, I am ruling in favor of Mr. Taylor. I believe that the presence of Dakota is not only important, it's essential. Therefore, the custody decision will be adjusted to reflect the bond between Mr. Taylor, his daughter, and their dog." The words hung in the air, a mixture of disbelief and relief flooding through Robert's veins. He could hardly process what the judge had said. The case that had seemed like an impossible battle had suddenly turned in their favor. "I'm granting you full custody of your daughter, Mr. Taylor," the judge concluded. "And I'm acknowledging that Dakota will remain a part of your family, as he has been. His role is not just that of a pet. He is a protector, a companion, and a lifeline for your family. And I cannot overlook that." For the first time in what felt like forever, Robert exhaled, his shoulders relaxing as the weight of the decision lifted from him. The trial was over. They had won. As the judge adjourned the court, Robert turned to look at Dakota, who was still sitting by his side, alert and calm as ever. The dog's gaze met his, and Robert felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude wash over him. Dakota had been the key to it all. The bond they shared, the unspoken understanding, the loyalty, the love, had carried them through the darkest moments of their lives. And now, it had led them to this moment of victory. Robert knelt down, his hands gently resting on Dakota's head, and whispered, "We did it, buddy. We did it. In that moment, as the courtroom emptied and the weight of the legal battle finally began to fade, Robert realized that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he and Dakota would face them together. They had already overcome the impossible, and together, they would continue to build the life they had fought for, one step at a time. The months following the courtroom ruling felt like a breath of fresh air to Robert. For the first time in what felt like a long time, the constant pressure and weight of the legal battle, the fear of losing Sophie, seemed to lift. It wasn't that everything was magically perfect, or that all the problems had disappeared overnight. But there was a profound sense of relief, a sense of peace, that washed over him like a gentle tide after years of being caught in a storm. In the weeks that followed the ruling, Robert began to notice small shifts in his own demeanor. He wasn't waking up every day in a panic, fearing what might happen next. He wasn't constantly bracing for the next emotional blow, the next crushing wave of uncertainty. Instead, he found himself waking up with a quiet hope, a renewed sense of purpose. There was still much to be done, still many challenges to face, but for the first time in years, Robert allowed himself to feel the peace that came with knowing he had fought for what mattered most: Sophie and their family, which now included Dakota, their steadfast companion. Each morning, as Robert rose to greet the day, the first thing he did was reach down to find Dakota, always nearby, always waiting. The dog's presence was a constant reminder that he was not alone, not anymore. Dakota had never left his side, had never wavered in his loyalty. No matter what Robert faced, the dog remained a quiet, unwavering presence, offering his support without question. Sophie had noticed it too. After the ruling, after everything had settled, she started to open up more, her smile brighter than it had been in months. She had always been a quiet child, wise beyond her years, but the events of the past had taken a toll on her too. There were nights when she'd lie awake, her mind filled with worry, her body stiff from the stress of living with epilepsy. But now, with the court case behind them, Sophie seemed to find a bit of comfort in the newfound stability. She would sit with Dakota, her small hands stroking his fur, talking to him about everything and nothing all at once. She found solace in the quiet companionship that the dog offered. The bond between Robert and Dakota continued to deepen. It wasn't just the shared moments of crisis that had forged their connection. It was the small, everyday things that mattered now. The quiet walks through the park, the peaceful evenings spent watching TV with Dakota curled up at their feet, the gentle nudge of the dog's head against Robert's hand as a reminder that he was still there, still offering his support. Robert realized that Dakota had done more than just keep him company during the darkest times. The dog had taught him something he hadn't fully understood before: the power of presence. Sometimes, all it took to heal was having someone or something there with you. You didn't have to talk or even try to fix things. You just had to be there, together. Dakota had done that for him every step of the way. It was a Sunday afternoon when Robert finally felt like he could breathe fully. He and Sophie had spent the morning outside, enjoying the sunshine, watching Dakota chase after a ball in the yard. The dog's playful energy was infectious, his happiness simple and pure. As Sophie giggled, watching Dakota run, Robert felt a weight in his chest lift. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to truly enjoy the moment. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, Robert found himself sitting on the back porch, Dakota at his feet, Sophie sitting beside him with her sketchbook. They were no longer just existing, they were living again, truly living. Sophie had been drawing, and Robert was content to sit in the silence, enjoying the quiet comfort of being together, knowing they were safe. The emotional scars from the trial, from the years of fighting and fear, were still there, but they were beginning to fade, replaced by new memories, memories of healing, of growth, of moving forward. Sophie spoke up then, her voice soft. "Daddy," she said, looking up at him with a curious expression, "do you think it's okay if I tell Dakota everything?" Robert raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" She smiled, her eyes glinting with a mix of mischief and tenderness. "Everything that's happened. About mommy, about the hospital, about the bad days, about the seizures. Robert's heart squeezed in his chest as he nodded slowly. I think Dakota already knows, honey. He's been with us through it all. Sophie reached out to scratch Dakota's ears, her fingers gently massaging the dog's head. Yeah. He always knows when I'm scared, when I'm having a hard time. I think he can understand me better than anyone else. Robert watched them, his heart swelling with love and pride. He had always known that the bond between Sophie and Dakota was special, but hearing her put it into words made it feel even more profound. The healing process was slow, and there were still difficult days ahead. But now, with the emotional weight of the trial behind them, there was a sense of possibility in the air. They were no longer just surviving, they were thriving. As the days went on, Robert found that he was starting to feel like himself again. He no longer woke up with the dread that had once consumed him. Instead, he woke up feeling lighter, more hopeful. There was still much to do: therapy for Sophie, ongoing medical care, and of course, life's daily challenges. But Robert no longer felt like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He had Dakota and Sophie and the quiet love that filled their home. That was enough. The emotional breakthroughs, the small moments of clarity, began to accumulate. Robert realized that it wasn't just the big victories, the legal battles won or the setbacks overcome, that mattered. It was the quiet moments that counted, the ones where he could truly feel at peace, where the future didn't feel so uncertain. And it was in those moments that he realized how far he had come. One evening after dinner, Robert and Sophie sat together in the living room, the house quiet except for the soft sound of the TV in the background. Dakota lay at their feet, his head resting on Robert's lap. Sophie had her head against his shoulder, and they shared a quiet, contented silence, the kind of silence that spoke of a deep, unspoken connection. Robert knew that things would never be perfect. They would face challenges ahead as every family did. But they had each other. They had Dakota, who had shown them what it meant to heal, to love, and to protect. And that, Robert realized, was enough to carry them forward through whatever came next. As he looked down at Dakota, the dog's eyes met his with a steady gaze. It was as though the dog was saying, "We've made it through the storm. Now we move forward together." And for the first time in a long time, Robert felt a deep, unwavering sense of peace. He had his family. He had his daughter. And he had the dog who had helped them heal. That was all he needed. Together, they would rebuild. Together, they would continue to grow. And together, they would face whatever came next. The crisp air of early autumn wrapped around Robert as he stepped outside, the warm glow of the setting sun casting long shadows across the yard. It had been a long time since he had felt the kind of peace that settled over him now, like a quiet blanket over the frayed edges of his life. The victory in the courtroom, the deepening of his relationship with Sophie, and the unwavering presence of Dakota, the dog who had been his constant, his support, had all contributed to a shift in the way Robert saw the world. They had come so far. The weight of the past, of the struggles and the battles, had finally begun to lift. Robert looked down at Dakota, who stood beside him, his dark eyes full of a quiet understanding. The German shepherd's tail wagged lazily, brushing against Robert's leg as if to remind him that the present was enough, that they were enough. It was a Sunday, a rare day where the world outside felt still, as though it had paused just for them. Sophie had gone inside to finish her homework, leaving Robert and Dakota alone in the quiet evening. Robert had been reflecting on how far they had come, the journey they had walked together, and how the dog had been the silent guardian of it all. From the moment they had met, each of them broken in their own way, they had found in one another a bond that was impossible to explain to anyone who hadn't witnessed it. Dakota wasn't just a dog. He was the bridge that helped Robert through grief, fear, and the overwhelming sense of loss. And now he was a symbol of resilience, of loyalty, of unconditional love. Robert smiled softly as he walked to the tree at the edge of the yard. It was an oak tree, sturdy and strong, just like Dakota. They had planted it together when they first moved into this house. a quiet gesture of hope for a better future. Now, as the leaves turned golden with the changing seasons, Robert realized that it was no longer just the tree that symbolized growth, it was Dakota and the unwavering bond they shared. Robert reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small, carefully wrapped package. The moment felt weighty, significant, as if he were about to mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. He had been thinking about this gesture for weeks, ever since the trial had ended and they had finally come to a place where things felt stable, where they could look toward the future with hope rather than fear. This wasn't just a gift. It was a tribute to the dog who had been with him through the darkest moments of his life. As he unwrapped the package, Dakota looked up at him, his eyes watching with a mixture of curiosity and trust. Robert held up a new collar, a rich, dark leather collar with an engraved tag that shimmered in the fading sunlight. It wasn't just any collar. It was personal, a symbol of the bond they shared. On the tag, Robert had inscribed a single word: loyalty. "Come here, buddy," Robert said softly, his voice filled with emotion. He knelt down, and Dakota immediately stepped forward, nuzzling his hand with a soft whine, as if he could sense the significance of the moment. Robert gently looped the collar around Dakota's neck, securing it with care. As he did, he spoke the words that had been in his heart for so long, but which he had never quite found the right moment to say. "You're not just a dog, Dakota. You're my family. You've saved me more times than I can count, and I'll never be able to repay you for that. This collar, it's just a small way to show you how much you mean to me. To Sophie. To all of us." The dog's ears perked up as Robert fastened the collar, and for a brief moment, it felt as though the world had quieted even more, as if everything had come full circle. Dakota didn't need words to understand. His eyes, those wise, knowing eyes, spoke volumes. He nuzzled Robert's cheek gently, his tail wagging in soft, steady strokes. It was as though he was saying, "I understand, and I'll always be here, no matter what." For Robert, that moment felt like a release, a letting go of the past. As he stood, looking down at the collar now adorning Dakota's neck, he knew they had crossed into a new chapter. They were no longer bound by the struggles that had defined them, by the grief and the fear that had once overshadowed their lives. No, now they were bound by something far stronger: love, loyalty, and a commitment to one another. They had healed piece by piece through their shared struggles. And now, as the sun dipped below the horizon, it felt like they were finally free to look ahead. With a deep breath, Robert stood and straightened. "Come on, boy," he said, giving Dakota a gentle pat on the side. "Let's take that walk we've been talking about." The evening air was cool and crisp, the kind of autumn evening that felt like a new beginning. As Robert and Dakota walked side by side down the path that led through their neighborhood, the familiar sights of the streets around them took on a new meaning. The world, which had once felt so uncertain, now seemed open with possibilities. There were no more looming battles, no more constant fear of loss. There was just this moment, just this walk, and just them. They walked slowly, enjoying the quiet that surrounded them. Dakota's paws made a soft rhythmic sound on the pavement as they passed familiar houses, the warm glow of lights shining from inside. The leaves crunched softly beneath Robert's feet, and the distant sound of children laughing filled the air. For the first time in a long time, Robert felt like he could breathe, like everything had finally fallen into place. "This is it, buddy," Robert said softly as they walked. "This is the life we're going to have from now on. Just you, me, and Sophie. Together." The dog looked up at him, his gaze steady, his body still beside him. In that moment, Robert realized that Dakota didn't need anything more than this. The dog didn't need accolades, praise, or special treatment. All he needed was the bond they shared. It was a bond of mutual trust, of respect, of understanding that went beyond words. It was a bond that spoke of shared memories, of challenges overcome, and of the deep loyalty that had been there from the very first moment they had met. As they reached the park at the end of their street, Robert stopped for a moment, taking in the sight of the sun setting over the horizon. The sky was painted with hues of orange, pink, and purple, the last traces of the day giving way to the soft glow of evening. It felt like a moment of closure, like everything had led to this. Dakota, ever the attentive companion, stood beside Robert, his gaze following the path of the sun as it dipped lower. Robert reached down, scratching the dog's ears affectionately. "You know," he said with a smile, "we've been through a lot, haven't we?" Dakota's tail wagged softly, as if in agreement. Robert laughed softly and gave him one last affectionate pat. Then they both turned and walked back home, side by side, with the quiet assurance that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. Back at the house, Sophie was waiting for them on the porch, a bright smile on her face as she watched them approach. "How was your walk?" she asked, her voice filled with the soft innocence of a child who had already begun to heal. Robert's smile widened as he looked at his daughter. "It was perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Just perfect." Sophie looked down at Dakota, who was now sitting beside Robert, his new collar gleaming in the last light of the day. "I think he likes his new collar," she said with a grin, her voice playful. Robert nodded, his heart full. "I think he does too." And as they stood there, the three of them, Robert, Sophie, and Dakota, together in the soft glow of the evening, it felt as though everything had come full circle. The struggles, the pain, the uncertainty, it had all led to this moment, where they were finally whole again, finally at peace. In that quiet evening, as they moved forward into their new life, Robert knew one thing for certain. No matter what the future held, they would always have each other. And that, in the end, was all that truly mattered. In the end, it wasn't just the judge's ruling that changed everything. It was the unspoken connection between a dog and its owner, something far stronger than any legal system could understand. The ruling, though important, was only a reflection of something deeper, something that transcended the courtroom, the raw, unwavering loyalty that Dakota had shown Robert and Sophie through the darkest times. It was a bond built not on words or written laws, but on shared experiences, mutual trust, and an unbreakable commitment to protect one another, no matter the cost. As Robert sat back and reflected on all that had happened, he realized that the love he shared with Dakota wasn't something that could be measured or defined by any legal document or courtroom judgment. It was something that lived in the small, everyday moments, the way Dakota always knew when Sophie needed him, how he never left Robert's side during his most difficult days, how they had both fought through their struggles together, silently, with nothing more than the promise that they wouldn't give up on each other. The true victory in all of this wasn't the custody of Sophie or the ruling in the courtroom. It was the realization that they had something far more precious than that. A family forged not just by blood, but by love and loyalty. Now, as Robert and Sophie moved forward, their journey wasn't defined by the challenges they'd faced, but by the strength of the bond they had with Dakota. A bond that had proven time and time again to be stronger than anything life could throw their way. But now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a bond like that with a pet? A connection so deep, so powerful, that it felt like they were a part of your soul? I'd love to hear your stories of loyalty and love in the comments below. How have your pets shaped your life, and what moments have defined your bond with them? Share your thoughts with us and let's start a conversation about the incredible relationships we share with our furry friends. If you believe in the power of love, loyalty, and second chances, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more heartwarming stories. Let's continue celebrating the bonds that define us and remind us every day that we are never truly alone. Thank you for joining us in this journey, and we hope you'll be back for more touching stories that show us just how powerful love can be. Remember, sometimes the most life-changing moments aren't the ones that happen in the courtroom or the ones marked by legal battles. Sometimes, it's simply the moments when love and loyalty speak louder than words.